Hi, everyone. I like, it's so funny. Every time that we do one of these events here out in the garden, the tree looks different. So sometimes there are no leaves, and other times, like literally a month ago, it was still super sunny out here. So it's kind of a nice thing with the little heat waves that we're having. But we're super excited to welcome you tonight to this very special event. I'm so grateful that Marie has taken the time to put us on her book tour and also to have Jeff joining. So we will get started. Um, my name is Joanna Belfer. I'm the owner of Bel Canto Books. Um, thank you. We are an independent bookstore that was started just before the pandemic in November 2019. So we're super excited to be around and now start to be having authors coming to our space out here in the campus garden. So we'll have Marie and Jeff have a discussion, maybe do a little reading. And then at the very end, we will have a book signing. The store is open, so you can feel free to shop around. Obviously, I can see lots of people have gotten drinks already. If you have not figured out where the restroom is, it's just inside that little room on the right-hand side. That's the restroom. So I'm always like, you got to know where that is. And I'm just going to read their intros really quickly so you know how special these two folks are. Marie Myung-Ok is an acclaimed Korean-American writer and the author of the young adult novel Finding My Voice, thought to be one of the first contemporary set Asian-American YA novels. She is one of the handful of American journalists who have been granted a visa to North Korea since the Korean War. She was the first Fulbright scholar to Korea in creative writing and has received many honors for her work, including an O. Henry Honorable Mention, the Best Book Award from the Friends of American Writers, and the New York Foundation for the Arts Fiction Fellowship. She's also a founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop and teaches creative writing at Columbia. She lives in New York City with her family. Welcome, Marie. And Jeff Yang has been observing, exploring, and writing about the Asian American community for over 30 years. He launched one of the first Asian American national magazines, A magazine, in the late 90s and early 2000s, and that writes frequently for CNN, Quartz, Slate, and elsewhere. He has written and edited 3 books, Jackie Chan's New York Times bestselling memoir, I Am Jackie Chan, A History of the Cinemas of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Mainland, and Eastern Standard Time, a guide to Asian influence on American culture. He lives in Los Angeles, California. And folks, feel free to come on through. It's okay. No worries. Please come on in. And you are enjoying a little light jazz as well from our neighboring Italian restaurant. So just think of it as a little extra ambiance. So without further ado, I will just turn this over to Jeff and Marie.
Thanks, Joanna. Thank you to our host. And I'm going to record some audio because this is something we're waiting for. This is kind of old home week for us a little bit. It's hard to tell, perhaps, because there aren't specific dates in our respective biographies, in part because we don't want to date ourselves, perhaps. But the New Yorkness of Marie and the New Yorkness of me kind of overlaps. In fact, A Magazine, early on in our existence, for those of you guys who remember A Magazine, we actually shared offices with the Asian American Writers Workshop, and I was an early member of the workshop that she founded. So there's a lot of history.
Occasionally I write stuff for A as well. It kind of like to lead back and forth.
Indeed. It was actually a pretty amazing time in that era, and so many of our friends have gone on to do really incredible things. But this is a night not just for nostalgia, just for talking about a truly amazing book and a truly amazing author with that author, and having had the chance to thank you. Having had the chance to read Evening Hero, I've got to say I was blown away. Literally within the first 10 pages, I was absorbed and just sort of ricocheted my way through until I got to the conclusion. It is such a big book, but a book so redolent with detail details and observations, even in little places. As you can see, I'm one of those post-it guys. Just sort of like places in the book which jumped out at me as such, dwelling in absurdity, even in a narrative that's really more of a dramatic and historical one. There's just so much in this book, and I wanted to begin really by asking you, first of all, this book has taken a very long time. How did this book begin? Where did it come from, really? And what was the journey to getting it to here?
Sure. To answer your first question, this is why I'm just so grateful that you're all here. Is this book has taken me 18 years to write and get published. And obviously when I started it, I did not think it was going to take 18 years. And we'll also mention that I had my publisher plan everything around this particular, because when Jeff was talking about, the early Asian American movement, I'm just so happy that there's an AAPI woman-owned bookstore in this metropolitan area. So I was basically, you guys go here, and then we're going to plan everything else, because this is just, and then I was sort of, sorry, Jeff, we're not going to Romance, we have to drive over here. But, yeah, so the novel actually started as an homage to Middlemarch, which is one of my favorite books, because I was also the Dr. Myung-Ok in my family. My parents didn't want me to be a writer. My father was a doctor, and that basically got him out of North Korea, and then eventually out of South Korea to immigrate here. So basically, as a kid when I'm 9 years old, typing away, going, I want to be a writer, that's something I could immediately say no. You did not become like Korean War refugee, so you could become a writer. You have to become a doctor, and that's very important. So, when I was 16, I already got something published in 17 magazine, and I was, trying to become a writer. But
One year before the actual magazine's title.
I know, right? I was a prodigy. As you saw, that I did write this YA novel, but then my adult literary career has been shorter, so I don't know why I ended up writing this huge book. But I wanted to do something first about a doctor who tries to do something right, but he ends up doing something wrong. In Middlemarch, it's also very funny. The doctor who tries to do something right and save this guy that everyone's trying to kill, he ends up killing the person by mistake, because it's sort of this comedy of manners in like small town, and I also grew up in a rural area. And then I also kind of wanted, I wanted to do something about I also worked as an investment banker, and I'm very interested in late stage capitalism. So I'm actually interested in private equity and how it's kind of ruining everyone's life without us really knowing about it. And we kind of think of healthcare as something that is just there. But actually, because of private equity, a lot of places like where I grew up in rural Minnesota, there are no more hospitals. You would think, oh, every woman who's going to have a baby, there should be a hospital nearby. That's a social contract. That is not a for-profit contract. So there are situations where people have to drive 100 miles, like in labor if they don't have a partner, because you feel like, how can this be? But that's how it is in the U.S. because we don't have, like more government oversight over healthcare. So I had this thing, like it was going to be this Middlemarch-ish thing, and it was actually more focused on the son, and it was going to be this like big book, kind of a big book of ideas. And especially as a woman writer, I kind of felt like, well, I want to do a Franzen, like really long book about ideas. But one of the things that the book has been under contract since 2012. Wow. I know, right? So that was just my problems getting it placed. That was just like the beginning of my other problems, among other things. And so what happened when the book was fairly ready to go, but in 2016, with the election, all of a sudden, I like to describe this book. The book is a satire, but was a book about healthcare, about satire, and satire needs access to function. And in 2016, when we had kids in cages, like satire as a literary device kind of went out the window. And so I ended up wanting to do something more baldly about race. And then also just looking at the U.S., like sort of the residua of the U.S. colonization of South Korea and North Korea to some degree. And so I ended up telling my editor, so before it was like this funny Middlemarch novel that they already knew how to market. But what ended up happening is I decided there was the older man in the background to the bro's son who's kind of lurking, and I kind of written him this filler. And I said, sorry, I want to bring this one forward. And, for my own like egotistical self, I wanted to write a big book of ideas. And the last thing is, this is one of the reasons we formed the Asian American Writers Workshop, was the whole, the immigrant story, and like everyone's writing with your grandma, and the lyrical, la la la, but the book itself wanted to be a story about this guy who's an immigrant. So to some degree, it was sort of freeing for me when the book kind of took off on its own and told me, like Yungman wanted to be the main character, and but in the meantime, Simon Schuster's like, normally people are really interested in like relatable characters who are younger, and most of our readers are like women and they're blah blah blah. And can you just do this? And it just became this like, no, I cannot. After this election, I just feel like it has to be more consequential. And I really wanted to, and they're like, can you cut this whole North Korean section? It's a little boring. And so it just became this huge fight for me because, as you know, publishing is 88% white. Like 88% of the editors are white. And experientially, it just became this, it's not that readable and it's like so long. And it just, so that, I really literally have spent much of the last 10 years like fighting to get the book into the shape that I wanted.
First of all, I very much appreciate the SpongeBob voice you go into when you speak from the voice of your white editors. But that said, I mean, you can kind of tell because that push and pull feels like it's a little bit on the page. And in fact, it translates into some of the tension among the characters themselves. And look, Yungman is an incredible character. And not only that, an incredible lens through which to see a lot of these changes. Because his very innocence in some ways, his like almost Candidian view of the world allows you to present the absurd in ways that doesn't lean into it, right? It makes it feel a little bit fresher and cleaner so that it's not as cruel, perhaps, as it could be. Although it is in some ways very cruel. And when I say cruel, I mean it's truthful. So there's this sequence, I mean, this is what you were talking about, in which Yungman's son, whose name is Einstein, for reasons we will discuss later, Yungman's son, who is a doctor himself, Harvard educated, has kind of moved on to sort of the next stage of evolution, if you will, the end-deity stage of evolution, and become a doctorpreneur working for this startup that is essentially taking medicine, repackaging it with clever slogans and almost like fast food sensibilities, and then putting it into malls. And he actually gets his dad, once his dad's hospital closes, because of all the reasons which Maria mentioned, he gets him a job at one of the outlets of this vast sort of medical industrial complex entity, which is called, it's acronym SANUS, and there's actually discussion back and forth about how to pronounce that. It doesn't rhyme with anus, right? So this is part of what makes the book so fun to read. Basically, there's a couple pages here in which Einstein is basically talking almost exclusively in acronyms. It's like, oh, I think I can get you into an EMBRO. An EMBRO? What's an EMBRO, right? And an EMBRO apparently stands for a mall-based retail outlet. So I just wanted to ask about that because these couple pages here, they feel almost in a tradition of satirical writing. Right? I mean, it feels like Vonnegut. It feels like, like Woolf. I don't know what your influences were. I mean, those were sort of very muscular writers in some ways, but I don't know what your influences were in terms of like getting humor here. But one of the things that I think people don't acknowledge enough is how funny Asian American writers can be. And part of it is that we have done a lot of big books that feel like immigrant epics and languor and melodrama. This is a book that punctuates, I think, with humor so frequently. I mean, I literally did LOL many number of times. And what was the shaping ground, I guess, for that comic approach?
One of the biggest compliments is when my editor blurted out, "This book is fucking funny." And so whenever I go to bookseller conventions, I just love saying, well, this is my editor said. You can put it as a shelf talker. I actually think one of my biggest influences was actually John Waters. He had a really interesting quote where he talks about how humor, if it's done right, can be used as a weapon. And I also like to describe this book as a funny book about genocide. So, because when going through like the atrocities of what happened during the American occupation after World War II in Korea and then the Korean War, it's sort of like there are books about it, but I kind of felt like it would be impossible to bear it without an equal, like, contrapuntal idea of humor behind it. So that's kind of it. The book was always funny, and Middlemarch is super comical, but this is part of it, the acronyms, and then just being able to see the darkness within the humor, because I just feel like if it was just about the dire, and I know people have written books like that, and I just felt like I couldn't keep it afloat without it being super funny.
Well, it is super funny. We appreciate you. I mean, this is the most recent book which I co-authored. It's called Rise. Similarly, it's the only similarity, I guess, of it is that it also is both an Asian American work and something that tries to tell the story behind the story of things. But we're nonfiction, and we're talking about a very squarely Asian American space. You have gone off and kind of encapsulated the Korean War, its aftermath, and also the immigrant journey that so many people made to both arrive here, but arrive here missing things and carrying things that they, in some ways, perhaps regretted with them to this country. And in that way, it does sort of fit that immigrant story you're talking about.
But you know what I'm loving about this discussion is one of the other like fighting problems we had is, you know, in publishing there's, as you know, what are called comps. Like your comp is this comp. And so Min-Jin Lee's Pachinko became such an overbearing, like, dominant comp for this. There was like, well, can't you write it like chronologically, like Pachinko? And I kept going like, you know, Pachinko is an epic, so it's and there's like, well, you know, it's easier to read if it's chronological, blah blah blah. And so I was trying to explain to them. For instance, there's 5 books. When you have 5, you have like a middle pillar, and then you have 2 to the side. And I was trying to explain to them that. Also, Min-Jin was writing more in like the classic Western tradition. We have rising action, and then a climax at denouement. I said, you know, with Yungman, because he's an immigrant and his memory's acting really weird because he's trying to forget all this stuff and he comes back in weird times. I'm saying I'm writing it in a more like Eastern way where it's cyclical and it's circular, and then it's using, because I've broken it up into books, it's using proximity to drive the action versus the rising action. And, you know, this is much more, and actually if you're interested in like how narrative works like that, Gish Jen wrote a fantastic book called Tiger Writing, where she articulates it much better than I'm articulating it now. But this was also one of these things where it was hard for the editors to be like, no, it has to be like Pachinko. And then worse, for the cover, they had a lady looking at the window, and then she had hanbok on, and it was like Joseon era. You know what I mean? Like these are like people who live like 20 families in a village. You know, they're kind of peasants in North Korea, and then they have like, what? Who is this person? Why is she like just a hanbok in this really fancy house? You know what I mean? It just became this sort of, I have to figure out my own way to differentiate it, and if I could tell a small anecdote. So, as you know, ginseng is like a big motif in the books, I thought. So first I said I would like to have an abstract cover because men writers get abstract covers with big because it says I'm serious. So I said, you know what I would really like is also you could have an abstract ginseng with like a giant erection on it. You know, like they grow like that. I said, you know, as far as you could push it with the obscenity, whatever. And they're just like, oh my God, now is Marie doing like first she's doing this. And so my agent, who's really good at calming everyone down, she was just kind of like, she was secretly Googling the whole time. And she found this on Google. She's like, well, there's this root pattern. So that calmed everybody down. And then she came up with this instead of the lady looking out the window. And the funny thing too is I'm loving being able to tell this to you because Simon Schuster said I could not share the prototypes. And I think they already know what I was going to try to do with it. Yeah.
I love
It's like,
your agent designed the book cover. I love it.
I know, right? By Googling.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, the ginseng scene in the book, and there is a specific ginseng scene, ginseng penis scene in particular. It's obviously a turning point of the book. It's climactic. It's part of what literally and figuratively re-energizes Youngman to make some decisions in his life. I mean, in so many ways, this book also is about a man almost like going through another almost like a post puberty, right, where he's once again reliving aspects of himself, but also making decisions. And there's a lot of that actually that hinges on the fact that his life has become very unpredictable and volatile. You know, his job is gone, the hospital is gone. Not just his job, the entirety of the thing he worked for is gone. His son is moved back into town for reasons quite unknown. And then his relationship with his wife has always been a little bit drifty, right? But the book itself really does hinge on this character of Yungman. And you mentioned, of course, your father is a doctor. My father's also a doctor. It is one of the other reasons why I felt so much resonance with this book. How much of him is in here, as it were?
That's a really good question, because this is probably my least autobiographical book, even though sort of the outlines are very similar. You know, like you said, your dad was like super Christian, and Yungman is like kind of wild cannon here, and he's always like so cranky about Christianity. My father's also super Christian. Do you know what I mean? Like, he kind of does the opposite of the stuff that Yungman does. But going back to the 2016, my father was a catalyst for the big shift in 2016, among other things, because so we live in a really rural area, and it's really rural. It's in northern Minnesota, and there's only one hospital. The closest next hospital, I think, is like 100 miles away. We're kind of like Canada. And so my father's an anesthesiologist. Yungman is an OBGYN. But the anesthesiologist is actually even more important in a town than the OBGYN, because the anesthesiologist is there for all accidents, births, and so forth. So he's probably involved in every single person in our town's life. So after 2016, especially when Trump was all getting into let's nuke North Korea, like his little thing, somebody in my town very proudly posted their bumper sticker. And my town has become like completely MAGA, and it was already MAGA-ish before, but it said, every day 152 species of animal go extinct. North Koreans need to be next.
Wow.
Yes, and I just thought, did you know that the person who saved your life, and then there was also all these talks about illegals and so forth. I was like, did you know that my father was also undocumented because he immigrated in 1953 when it was, not because he was an illegal, it was because it was illegal to be Asian in the US, basically. So just the fact that these people could have lived with their family this entire time and be calling for genocide of our family, basically, just kind of also, that's what made it so urgent for me. You know what I mean? Again, the idea of, oh no, I'm this woman writer writing this immigrant story. Here I go again. You know, just like my own ego, I wanted to write something more Franzen-ish, I guess. But at the same time, it became very simple to me. I need to show there is this one North Korean dude who's this little Asian guy, which he talks about in the prologue, who has this epic story behind him. I mean, just the idea, I mean, it sounds stupid, but just humanizing one North Korean became sort of my raison d'etre to some degree in what I hoped I'd get out of writing this, you know.
I think one of the other points of reference that I felt really connected was obviously that Minnesota backdrop. My roommates actually in college were both from Minnesota, so I actually have tried Lukefisk. I know what Minnesota Nice is about. A particular passive aggressive form of sort of
hostility,
surface niceness, and deep seated. Why have you not folded your laundry? Kind of, you know, which was a thing. Anyway, but Minnesota is kind of a weird place in that there is a very deep sense of civility and even kindness to a certain extent, but underneath that strata, lots of stuff is going on, and you can see that even politically, right? On the one hand, there's a lot of progressiveness there, but they also, you know, elect people like Michelle Bachmann in office, right?
Absolutely.
And you see that in the book here. The other thing is that for the handful of people who are people of color in these extremely, you know, white areas of kind of the whitest cities the whitest states in the union, really. There's a very different kind of experience of just living. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that actually pays off later on is that there are only two Asian people who live in this town of
Horsesborough.
Right, which is the name of the town. They both happen to have the last name Kwak. One is Chinese and owns the Chinese restaurant in town, and the other is, of course, Yungman Kwak. Is that something that you actually experienced as well? Were you guys that sort of only, the only Asians in town when you were growing up or so forth?
I would have been happy if there was a Chinese family. Just being the one family, wasn't even that we were the only Asians. We were the one family of color. So anyone who had racist tendencies, they would just gravitate to our family. Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't even just anti-Asian. It was just like racism in general. Our family became this catchphrase for it.
You caught it all, right? Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I want to speak also to the relationship that Yungman has with his son. And again, if Yungman has elements of your father, I don't know how much of yourself is in Einstein, but Einstein is sort of this kid who grew up as like a lot of expectations, hothouse kid in a lot of ways, and you can tell those expectations are very high. I mean, refugee, undocumented parents do tend to place a lot on the next generation because his full name actually is Einstein Albert Schweitzer Nobel Kwak.
Wow.
And this is not just an Asian American thing, but it's a very Asian American thing. That the aspirational stuff around us ends up being what we name our kids, right? So you've got lots of kids named Harvard and Princeton, or Hilton, or whatever. So this is something that resonated with me as somebody who has two kids named Hudson and Skylar. What was it that led you to actually kind of plant this here? And it's really just the character of Einstein, who, as you said, was originally kind of the protagonist originally.
Right. And he was he was kind of just your usual sort of franzinist, not super likable, but interesting protagonist. And actually, my cousin's here, so she'll be able to vouch for. So I was actually the weirdo in the family, because it's not. I wouldn't say that this is based on my brother, but my oldest brother was really smart. He got into Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and then when it was my turn, I was kind of a middle child, and here I was already writing and doing all this stuff, and my staff scores weren't that great. And so my sister also got into Harvard, and I did not get into Harvard. And my parents were literally, you have to understand, I think, because my father did so well in TAFE, he got to go to school in Tokyo for a while during the colonization, and then he went to Seoul National University, which basically changed his life. So for him, me being so dumb, I didn't get into Harvard, was, wow, you just already ruined your life by. That year Brown was the most difficult school to get into, and he only knew Harvard, Yale, Princeton. So he didn't even know Brown was an Ivy League school, and it just became this lame. No, literally, because he would everyone flew with my brother to school, and I was by myself. And it really was like, oh, okay, you just fucked up your life by, you're just. But for me, what was really helpful was that, excuse my language, I tend to swear a lot. Sorry. But what was helpful is because I had to figure out what made me happy, and I was already kind of wanting to be a writer, and because now my parents were paying as much attention to me, so I flunked out of pre-med with inorganic chemistry. I flunked out, and then my parents said, well, you can't major in creative writing, you have to do, or English, you have to do something that's really solid. But the good thing is at Brown, the econ major had the fewest course requirements, and then I also had this idea that I was going to work probably as an investment banker so I could fund my writing. So at the same time, I did get into a program at Goldman Sachs where we went to Harvard Business School. So for 6 years, my parents were like, oh my gosh, you can go to Harvard Business School. And the whole time I was like, I'm going to make so much money so I can finally be a writer. And it really became this thing where for years, even after my first book came out, they were just like, you could still go to veterinary school. You like animals. This whole idea that I could ever make a living as a writer was just so foreign to them. So yeah, they were very, I would say almost classically, you have to go to Harvard. And I kind of understand because when they first came here in 1953, my father had to work at a Jim Crow hospital in Birmingham because foreign doctors all had to go get their internship redone, even though my father went to Seoul National University. He went to the Harvard of Korea. You think, can he practice as a doctor? No, all the foreign doctors, and there were only a couple schools. And then you also realize financially what they did is they could pay them 5 cents, and then also they could send the foreign doctors. At first, I think my dad thought black people got more sick because he's like, all my patients are black, but then he didn't realize about the segregation. And then when he realized that, Then that just spooked him so much. That's when he decides the kids are never going to learn Korean. We're going to make them as American as possible. They all have to go to Harvard. Like any thing that he could tick off, what became this thing. So you know what I mean? I can kind of really see where it came from, even though it was so hurtful because my SAS scores weren't that great. I tried. Just the idea that when I'm 19, that my life is over. They really were like, your life is bye. You just started messing it up.
I remember I wanted to apply to Brown also, and then I remember my dad saying, "Brown is not a school. Brown is a color."
That's about what my dad said. Like, yeah. Oh God.
But
this is very triggering.
I'm sorry. But to that point, there's also a beat here. I mean, we're talking about segregation and everything. It's humor about genocide is hard enough. Humor about the deep-seated, and institutionalized history of racism in this country, that's a lot closer to home. But there's this one moment where Yungman, again, this sort of like Candidian soul, is talking about, kind of encountering segregation, right? And he refers to, he sees the colored water fountain. He's like, I want to try some colored water. It's like this, right? And it's beats like that which I'm like, wow, how scathing and yet subtle it is to be able to kind of invert some of these moments and force people to look at it a different way. This is the language we use. This is the kind of things we imposed on our society, the artificial divisions, and at the end it's absurd. One other thing before I think it would be great for you to read something as well. There's another moment that really punched me in the gut and made me laugh at the same time, because it's something, again, that I felt really close to. My dad speaks fluent English, a little different accent, but the one thing that he can't get, because people of his generation and other generations who are immigrants and second language English speakers, idioms are very hard, but even harder when they are sung, when they're part of music, right? Because when you hear music, you hear lyrics, and people don't know what they mean. There's the whole Mondegreen thing, right? Which is misheard lyrics that people then kind of interpret as something else. In this case, there's a situation where Yungman's trying to impress the head of the department. This is something my dad was really bad at politics in the hospital he worked at for his entire life. He did try, though, and it always failed because he just didn't know how to talk about sports. He didn't enjoy the same things, have the same interests, eat the same food, didn't go to the same schools as all these people. And the few attempts he tried to have, people over to our house, and my mom cooked something that was not Chinese for them, it always ended up being super uncomfortable and awkward, in part because of little things like this. So there's this moment where Yungman is trying to impress Nitzner, who's, again, head of the department, because he loves music, loves singing, and he always hears him humming this one song, this one soul song. And so he's like, oh, that one song you sing, tell me more about it. Tell me more about the one-eyed got. And, this is the one-eyed and then G-O-T, right? And he thinks the lyric is the one I got, but the song is actually Ain't No Woman Like the One I've Got. And he hears it differently. And of course this provokes just complete what are you thinking kind of reaction. Is that like something you pulled from life, or is that just something that...
No, I love Mondegreens so much. I just love Mondegreens, and I actually kind of built the whole book around this joke. I worked hard on that Mondegreen book, yeah.
Well, I too would like to meet the one I've got. With that, let's have you read a little bit,
sure.
And then we'll open things up for questions, I think.
Okay, so I'm just going to read from this kind of earlier, and it's actually something that Jeff alluded to a little bit about. So here's Yungman, he's lost his job, he's going to do this gig thing at the Mall of America, except one of the problems is that he thinks he's going to be administering vaccines, but then he finds, well, listen. Yungman had to take an employment test. He always did well on tests. Do you have any medical board violations or pending cases? Is your Minnesota license current? Are there any arrest warrants out for you, or have you ever been convicted of a felony or spent any time in jail? Are you certified by the American Board of Obstetrician and Gynecology? The blue-haired lady grated his test and, apparently satisfied, sent him down the hall to another nondescript room with another middle-aged woman. He put his resume down on the desk in front of her. Reggie, his grandson, had helped him put it together last night on the computer. She didn't even glance at it, but asked to see his Minnesota license. And you don't have any tremor conditions like Parkinson's? Of course not. He was affronted. I'm a surgeon. No medical board or malpractice actions? No. She took his fingerprints. Why, again, he didn't know. Yungman was then given an address, a floor, a wing, a sector, a door number. He traversed a skyway to the mall and walked for what seemed like miles past Earring Pagoda, Orange Julius, Three Gaps, I Left So My Heart in Minnesota, Victoria's Secret, only in Minnesota, Forever 21, all fronted with riot gates, oddly like they had in Korea when demonstrations were commonplace. He saw no one as he strode past Nickelodeon Universe, manic characters frozen in midair, roller coasters eerily stilled on their tracks. Door 12-0003 was a dark storefront, barred gate also in place, across from a gaudy mega restaurant, the Rainforest Cafe. Through the ambient light, he spied a single counter, like the check-in at an airline's gate. Next to the counter, the letters ATM glowed. He rattled the gate and called, "Hello." From behind the counter, a dark-haired young woman detached from the gloom and motioned for him to go down the side hall, where there was a small back door into the store. "You're late," she said, exasperated. "You know it's Black Friday, right?" She had a slight, unplaceable accent. Belarus? Moldova? Romania? She took his employment sheet and slipped it into a machine that sat behind the reception counter. Out popped a silicone wristband with a tiny holographic disc, which she then held underneath what looked like a supermarket price scanner. "Y Kwak," read the LED display in cubular font. "Scan it. It starts the clock." She gave him a clip-on badge that said, "Trainee." Hers said, "Trainer." In the very back of the place was a small storeroom, its shelves piled with inventory. In the middle, on a folding table, a woman lay naked from the waist down in lithotomy position, her head propped up with one hand so she could check her phone. Yungman tried not to stare. "Hi," she chirped from the table. Hello," Yungman said back. "Nice to see you. This is Jenny, our standardized customer. They get one free treatment for volunteering." "Why do we need a standardized patient?" he asked. True, normally Maud, his nurse, administered the flu vaccines, but intramuscular injection was hardly something Yungman could forget how to do. "You have run a laser defolliculator number 2 before?" she said with surprise. "And no," said Yungman. "Now they were using lasers for vaccines." She turned back to the clipboard she was carrying. "Just to confirm, do you have a Minnesota State medical license? Any pending malpractice lawsuits or medical board actions? Any felonies?" "Yes, no, no, no," he said obediently. This was getting annoying. She handed him a white coat that said Shanna's mall-based medicine on the pocket. "It's $10 a day to rent." "I have a white coat back home," he said. "Paying for a coat?" "Consistency across the brand," she said. "We really have to hurry here." Yungman sighed as she left to go make a copy of his credit card. While the trainer was gone, Yungman did not know where to put his eyes, so he picked up a brochure from a pile. "Make Mine Medical. Grand opening. Special medical retail puts the treat back into treatment. Speedy dialysis. In and out chemo. USA Cancer Care. Depilation Nation. 4 eyes, LASIK, and vision testing. Quick View, MRI imaging. Barry's Bariatric, now with Barry's Junior lap bands. Dome Depot, Neurology and Psychopharmaceuticals. Faster than the ER. Pharmacies, medicines, body care, clothes, appliances, and gifts. Vaccines are us. Keep this, it's your only receipt. White coat deposit plus $500 incidentals at Depilation Nation. Depilation Nation, he said, looking up. We really need to start your training. The store opens, she checked her gadgety Santa's watch, in 15 minutes. Yungman wanted to correct her gently. I'm actually supposed to be administering vaccines at Vaccines R Us. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, not according to your ID. Welcome to Depilation Nation, where unwanted hair comes to die. A Santa's medical retail outlet. Laser, mustache, pubic hair depilation is less painful than waxing or tweezing. No annoying stubble. Cleaner skin with less chance of infection. Physician administered for highest safety standards. Perfect smoothness and permanent results, asterisk. Financing available, double asterisk. Your results may vary. They don't have doctors at Vaccines R Us, just nurses' aides and nurses. It was true that when in a hurry, sometimes Yungman got his annual flu shot at Walgreens. Some clerk did it. There was never a doctor in sight. OBGYNs work here, she said in her accented voice. I don't mean to sound flippant, he said, but depilation is even less of a medical procedure than vaccines. This is the exclusive FDA-approved machine for pubic hair depilation, and it requires a doctor to operate it. Pubic hair? Why would anyone want to depilate that? It is an elective healthcare therapeutic. Yungman wanted to clutch his head. Health? Pubic hair cushioned and protected the sensitive skin of the area. Depilation was unhealthy for it. Folliculitis, various infections. How did he end up in this absurd situation? Yes, it was Einstein. Doctors shouldn't disease monger, he said. Pubic hair is not a pathology and should be left alone. Use your coat back. He could sit in some cafe somewhere and have a pretzel until the day was done. The store needs to open. She looked at him. You know, I'm a physician too. Excuse me? I was an OB in my country. Then why are you... The trainer leaned over her electronic slate and typed furiously into it. I can't work here legally. Yungman stared. Was she perhaps illegal from a different country? Maybe South America? Or Muslim? She had pale skin, violet eyes, and just underneath her curtain of black hair, a plum-sized burn scar on the side of her face that looked like a second, smaller set of lips. If you leave, there'll be no one to work this shift. I'll be in trouble. Black Friday is one of the biggest days. Please don't leave. I need this job. My educational visa has expired. I can't go back to my country for many reasons. I have a child. This job is what feeds us. Yungman paused. He knew the feeling. Hey, the standardized patient said, canting to her head to look up at Yungman. Can we get going here? I'll be with you momentarily. Yungman smiled at her. A nice white lady. She couldn't even begin to fathom the life of an undocumented immigrant. Her fears would be along the lines of missing a good deal in a microwave at a Black Friday sale, not living with the icy fear of a hand on the shoulder. Indeed, the INS was now called ICE. She probably envisioned illegals as dirty and scary, and not the two doctors in front of her now. He turned to the trainer. Might as well get her through the day so she wouldn't get fired. It says on the sign you also offer mustache hair removal. Can I do that? She shook her head and typed again. Mustache is on the menu solely to get around obscenity codes because we are within 500 feet of a children's playground, the Nickelodeon universe. A beep from her Santa's watch, followed by a misting sound, that smell of air immediately after a violent August thunderstorm. It's ozone, she explained. The Santa's watch comes with a mister that deploys if it senses stress to neutralize sweat odor from employees. Please, her eyes said. He recognized that hunted look. All right, he said. Yungman tried to listen carefully as she explained how to use the laser defolliculator number 2 on different kinds of pubic hair. The standardized patient was pleased to receive a double coupon.
So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense for how the book works. Again, Yungman is such an incredibly well-realized character. I wanted to open up the floor now for questions from you guys, and we can continue conversing if there is any pause in the questions. But does anybody have anything they wanted to ask Marie? Or
I have several, but I'll start. Marie, are your parents still alive?
My father passed away actually a couple decades ago. My mother is still alive, but she also has dementia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you were pursuing this career, at first you said they weren't moving as association. My father was a doctor too, Korean immigrant, and when I said I was a journalist, my parents were like, "No, no." But I did anyway. So I'm curious if your parents are moving around. If your father died of this, would that be not?
You know, the really sad thing is that they really dissuaded me quite vigorously at every juncture that I could have had. But then after my father passed away, because I'm a writer, he left me his diaries. And in one of the entries, luckily, you know, because my parents were educated, he even from the 1940s on, he wrote them in English. But one of the ones that he wrote when he was working at the hospital where we were growing up was he was actually writing these little short stories. Like one of them was like, "Hello, Dr. Reynolds." Me. "Hello, Dr. Lee. How are you?" "I am fine." The end. But he was writing these little stories and then never said a word to me the whole time. He was yelling at me saying I could not become a writer because that is a crazy, ridiculous thing to do. So sadly, no, I don't think my parents ever, and even though my mother is, even before she had dementia, even though she's also fluent in English, she's never really read any of my work. But then occasionally when it gets on the Korean media and all my friends at church say, "Oh my God, I rewrote this article" or something, then she reads it a little bit. But it somehow, in a weird way, because my parents also found their war experience so traumatizing. So they're probably about 10 years old. They're 10 years older, slightly more than Yungman. Yungman was more like child during the war. And my mother also had to cross over the 38th parallel right after World War II when she was 14, and all these things happened because of the trauma that they felt like no matter how many times we would ask them questions, they wouldn't answer, or they would give us really like conflicting answers. They would, you know what I mean? It's like we never got. In fact, at one point, I even like signed my mom up for like the Korean American Story, where they have like these lights and everything. I'd be like, well, under the lights, she's gonna actually tell us a story. But it became all the weird, disjointed things that came before. So to some degree, this book. Not only did I want to decenter like narratives of the Korean War from what we know from newsreels and like white written, you know, history books, it's everything. The details from this all come from survivors, either Koreans that I've interviewed and like American GIs. Because in a weird way, for me, this is also the only way I could write my way back into my parents' story, because I will never know what exactly happened. And I think a lot of people in that generation were like that. Even though I also feel like, I don't know, not in a therapeutic way, but I feel like because, you know, generational memory is so short, unless we kind of face it now, I even feel like having been born here, like I can just, you know, we are kind of like, sort of like the receivers of our parents' trauma, even though we don't understand, and they're knowing more about epigenetics, that really does happen. And so I kind of feel like unless we really face, because the Korean War is the only war that they've called the Forgotten War. And actually, when I dug up a little history of it, they dubbed it the Forgotten War in 1952. The U.S. is already pretty determined that everyone's just going to forget it, because it was also the first extra legal war that they went into, and then it doesn't have a good narrative. You know, Vietnam was what not to do next time. You know, and World War II was the Greatest Generation, but Korea's like, ooh. Like we kind of
Korea was just MASH. That's that's the only
right?
thing people know about it.
Korea's like, we're going to make all the Koreans fight each other for some weird geopolitical reason that nobody understands, and that the casualties are almost as high as the Vietnam War. But we don't even think of that because we're somehow mentally not allowed to think about the Korean War. So this is also like my way of being like, here, putting it in people's faces. It's there, and this is what happened. And also for when growing up in my small town where it's so militarized, you know, the VFW is such a big part. If I had to hear one more person say, "You should be so grateful, we fought over there, that's why you're here," and I was just kind of like, if you say that to me one more time, I think I'd rather live in North Korea. You know what I mean? It just became this whole, you know, thing where people just didn't even understand what they were saying. So yeah, that's a question.
there. So you actually bring up something that I wanted to ask about as well, which is we talk a lot about Yungman, but not so much about Yungay, right? And even though she's obviously Yungman's wife, is sort of off to the side for much of the early part of the book, we do find out more about her in the part of the center of the book where he goes back and reviews his memories, and it's actually kind of like a very evocative and very immigrant love story, right? It's one of those love stories which, as with many of the stories I think of our parents getting together, when you hear the story, it's not what you expect it to be. And, you know, Youngman's wife is, as it turns out, also a doctor. In fact, she was the #1 student in the school until things happened.
She got pregnant, and then also they
Einstein
came
had-
here because they thought she could get an abortion, but this is pre-Roe versus Wade. There's actually like a very weird plot about that, yes.
And the thing is, the way that you draw her, and the way that also you draw, there's like a love triangle that also exists there. It's almost like an interlude, but it's something that really shows a lot. That kind of colors in why their relationship as older people is the way it is. There are little moments where it's clear that it's a one-sided romance. Youngman's always loved her, but she has always kind of floated in the space of somewhere between tolerating, admiring, and occasionally feeling warmth towards him, but not passion, not love. And there's this moment where they're at Einstein's house and they see a wedding photo of his, and he's sort of clutching her arm in the picture. She's sort of looking off to the corner of the screen. Something really kind of it hit me a little hard because I feel a little bit like that's how my own parents' relationship was as well. But the character of Young-A is also really interesting because she is somebody who could have been the protagonist of this story, but other things different. And yet you decided to write this from a male perspective. The evening hero's perspective. That's the other thing, by the way. The premise of the book. The evening hero is Yungman because Yungman's name, Myung-Ok Kwak, actually translates into the evening hero. And in a couple moments, his wife and other people call him the evening hero, mostly sort of like sarcastically. But what made you decide to tell the story from the perspective of a man?
That's a really good question because in earlier drafts there was more Young-A in there, but I think part of it first was Youngman's voice, not to sound too schizophrenic or something, has always been this driving, him coming up with, he came up with a lot of the funny stuff and then I would laugh while I was writing it. So he just had this very distinctive voice to me. And then also, the book starts with an epigraph of your usual cheerful Korean proverb. I think it's like your whole life could be ruined because of a single mistake. And so it also got me thinking in the kind of what if writer way of, when you're a little kid, you feel like, oh, if I make a mistake, I'll just hide it. And then the next day will pass. And there was a little bit of a what if moment. What if something awful, Yungman did something awful, but even he was young and is just trying to erase it. And also coming to the U.S. is like another big break, as many immigrants do. And so Young-A is a little bit reflective of that because the unease is this chronic underlying tension with them, but it's because of Youngman's mistake and the thing he did that she does not know. And that's kind of this atmosphere that I was trying to create. And then the big question is, as it is for all of us, there's still time left. Will we try to rectify it, or will we do the easier thing and just wait for tomorrow, and then one day we'll be dead? So that was just kind of an existential question I was exploring in this book too. Like, how late is too late?
Well, in some ways, it feels like the book sort of suggests it's not too late, right? That, in fact, a lot of the things, the post-ginseng penis moment, Yungman actually is very different and makes decisions and choices and even shares revelations about his past that it feels like connects with Young-A in a way.
Right, and she kind of thinks he's hot after that. Yeah.
Right? Even the big mistake, right? In some ways, to a certain extent, makes her feel like, oh, that's how much you like me, right?
Right, and I think to some degree, too, Youngman has had this self-esteem problem where he sees himself in a way that other people don't see him. And he doesn't really realize that until in these very intense situations, like when they're going to North Korea.
that's as much spoiling as really you're going to get from this. I definitely read the book because so much goes on in it. This really, if this were to be brought to the screen as I would love for it to be somewhere down the line, I feel like it needs to be a television series, not like Pachinko.
No.
A series.
You know, Minjin and I have the same agents in Hollywood too, so it's really interesting. Yeah.
In fact, there, you know, like even as I was reading it, I was like mentally casting it and so forth. But it is such a book with verve and with humor and also with very deep emotion and historical reference points. There's a lot of darkness beneath the light and light beneath the darkness in it. And you know, hopefully, if you haven't gotten a book yet, you'll be experiencing it in the next couple of weeks. But I'd love to hear, you know, on Twitter or elsewhere, what you guys think about it, and whether you also agree with me. I guess we're a little bit past 7 now.
Yes, we did the signing.
But any other questions before we?
I'm just curious. There's this renaissance going on now with the books coming out that are not maybe the conventional story. So do you see that sort of where younger generations are not fearful of going into the field? What do you think is happening there?
I think, you know, just number-wise, it's really exciting to see how much there is. At the same time, the impetus that we had starting the Asian American Writers Workshop 30 years ago had to do with nurturing writers so we could be tough enough to really stand up to the gatekeepers who are determining what actually is Asian American writing or what is like portrayals of Asians and so forth. So I think what's really tough and sort of disheartening for me, because I teach writing, is you may or may not have been here. This is big kerfluffle on Twitter, which may not filter down, but within the writing community, there is a thing, I guess, to sort of say it inarticulately, where a lot of white men are complaining because they think only people of color are getting published right now, where empirically it is the opposite. In fact, in editorial, in publishing, it's 88% white, which is like down to like 89% like 5 years ago. You know, it really hasn't changed in, you know, since Toni Morrison was an editor. And so recently, you know, it's so empirically incorrect that it just kind of hurt my heart to see. You must have heard, because you're into media, like James Patterson came out and said that. He's like, okay, so yeah, like white men are the victims here. And then Joyce Carol Oates said something so similar. Yes, it's so sad because white men will never get published again because people of color are taking up everything. And, you know, you're just like, you know, this is just this other form of oppression and racism where it's sort of like, oh, again, we don't believe that racism against people of color authors exists, when empirically it's so obvious that it's true. I mean, like 99, I think it's like 90% of books are still like written by white men and reviewed by white men. I mean, it's so overwhelming, and it's changed within, you know, hardly like any statistical significance over the last couple of years. So while at the same time, it's there are more authors and there is more visibility, I still think it's so important for these spaces like this where we can nurture the writing. And it's not even like I will just nurture any writing. You know, we need rom-coms, we need mysteries, we just, you know, we need, you know, silly books, we need funny books, we need badly written books. You know, let's get like I don't think Colleen Hoover is a badly written book, but she just writes like really popular stuff that seems very skimmy. You know what I'm saying? Like we need just like everything. Where just because we have like Minjin, you know, and then there's like Jason Reynolds or something, just because there's a couple people, I think that also gives an illusion that we're okay. And I don't feel like we're okay. And what's ironic is when the Asian American Writers Workshop, before we had an actual space, we shared space with the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. And 30 years ago, and, you know, they're still around because they need to be around. Because now we're seeing this huge renaissance, so to speak, of anti-Asian violence in New York. And so, no, I'm excited to see that there are more authors, but I still feel like there's so much more work to be done, and there's so much. That's why I'm so grateful for all of you here, because we need people coming out and supporting the writers. Because otherwise, again, it's, you know, I'm an economist. This is a consumer product. if the product does not sell, it's like, bye. Jonathan Franzen wrote 4 crapola books, and then the 5th one, like, was the corrections or whatever, because, you know what I mean? Or the WeWork guy. The WeWork guy just got a bunch of more, like,
$350 million to basically we work it all over again. It's called, it's like we home thing.
right? Yeah, this is great. But you see what I'm saying? But then for people like us, we have like one crappy book, and then it's just like, those stories don't sell, which is another form of racism, but most people are not smart enough to be able to parse that. Do you know what I'm saying?
I gotta say that James Patterson was sort of the front man for this whole idea that white men are not getting jobs is the most galling thing, because that dude has not written a book for like 30 years.
Right. Other people write his books.
He has a factory,
Yes,
a farm,
of dudes
right?
writing books for him.
Of all white men, mostly,
Yes.
or almost all white people.
Yeah, so it's another like 500 white men getting published basically.
It's crazy.
Yeah, the whole thing is like, it was so unnecessary.
I mean, you know, if I would answer that question, I would say this. I think that there's been a pivot, but I think the pivot has less been about there being a sudden volume of new people entering the space, and more like the pent up degree of talent that's been damned.
Right.
I mean, this is Maria's second book in 20 years. You know, that is pretty fucked up. When you read this, you'll realize how much talent has been pent up for those years. And you have other reasons, perhaps. You know, this book took a long time to write, but there's no reason why James Patterson could farm out, 300 books in that same period, all of which were just extruded from his literary soul.
Yeah.
You know, where this book took so many years to create something so good. It is time for a difference, and that difference isn't about trying to travel within the 8%, 10% of people of color margin of error that publishing has. It is about changing the frame of reference.
Right. We think this stuff is good, and just as another frame of reference, it got rejected by 25 publishers, including McSweeney's, Soft Skull Press, all these small ones. Only one publisher made it. Luckily, it was Simon & Schuster. But I was one publisher away from never selling this book, and I have 2 books in my drawer that I never sold. Yeah.
It's great that the information being by writers, obviously, very clear. We need more Asian Americans and publishers.
Oh, absolutely.
Editors. So was there across the American country that you see more Asian Americans of color?
The problem with publishing is it pays like a sub-living wage, so it's traditionally been people who are very wealthy. And people who tend to be very wealthy and can live in New York tend to be white. So it's very structural. And I don't see it changing right now. They don't have programs to help people do that. And then similarly, one of the reasons at Columbia I never do anything with the MFA program is because I think it's a scam. You have to be able to pay $120,000 for the privilege of being taught by people like me. And then they don't give you any housing help. So you have to think structurally. And whenever I tell the students, I decided instead of taking the 2 years off, even if it were fully funded, I'm going to work because this is called the opportunity cost. You're going to lose out on the money. And the students still have this very gauzy notion of, well, they actually get on my case, like, oh, I can't believe you work for the man. And I'm sort of like, oh, that's interesting. Like, how are you going to live in New York by yourself and sustain yourself for years? But there's just this whole idea of this is what writers are. And what I'm finding interesting too about what you're saying about the Asian Americans, what I'm loving is when we started the Asian American Writers Workshop, this is a way for people who are already employed and aren't going to take all this time off to become MFAs. So all these people who creep in, I'm a lawyer, I think I'm interested in writing, and this one person kept getting rejected, and that was Monique Trong. And at one point, a bunch of other people came creeping in, and they were like, we're kind of interested in writing, but, we're not going to give up writing. We're going to come to these little workshops. There was a workshop that had Ed Lin, Kathy Park Hong, Min Jin, and Ed Lin, and it was taught by this then unknown author. It was Jumbo Harry. But so it's like,
I know those guys.
right? But it's like, this is what we have to do. We have to do it for ourselves. This is the only way we're going to get strong enough to do it for ourselves, and then also to support others. Because
I just got to say that even like that charter set of people who are part of the CAB version of the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence co-hosted version of the Asian American Writers Workshop, I think almost all of them have written and been published, and several of them have written and been published with like best-selling books, critically acclaimed books, or gone on in other ways to be really kind of literary lions. And I feel like that really is where this kind of seeding of opportunity begins. It isn't just about breaking into publishing or becoming, literary, New York Times bestsellers. Don't get me wrong, I liked it, but there is absolutely that need to at the fostering of the spark, right? Getting people to feel comfortable with telling stories, and so many people who, again, have had to go through other careers. I was just talking to Helen Wong, who old friend of mine from back when, a lawyer who, in her spare time, literally just jotting down in a notebook, wrote this book called The Partner Track,
Right.
that is now a Netflix TV series.
It looks fantastic.
It's actually quite fun. It's not big literary fiction. It doesn't matter. It was what she wanted to write, and it has some really smart stuff in it. But she did it while, again, doing her day job. And when people scoff at that, and especially for Asian Americans who have cultural reasons, parental pressure reasons, why often we have to take a big left turn before we get to where we really want to be. We cannot afford to not encourage that spark wherever it comes from.
Right. I mean, probably for each of the four founders, we have probably lost at least one book each, doing all the volunteer work for that decade, getting it up. But at the same time, it was just like this necessary thing for us. And our founder finally has a book coming out 30 years later. But it's been this very triumphal thing. I mean, with the premiere party, and like Curtis flew in for that, and so just to have those four friends, it finally happened. That was worth it in itself, because it's not. Do you know what I mean? So there are other things that that you could do, is like starting a book club, or just coming to events like this, doing just structurally trying to prop up from below. So that's the only way people there are going to notice. Basically,
it's not just writers' workshops or writing in the literary vein either. I should add, I just talked to Julie Ha and Eugene Yi, who were editors at Korean Journal, right? Who just created this documentary, Free Chol Lee, which is amazing, and which got huge acclaim at Sundance. And it's actually, last night it played in theaters across America for one night only. But again, a community publishing entity has been able to open doors for people to simply feel like they can contribute, that they could get bylines, that they could write. And again, it's fostering the spark. A magazine, same. So, sorry, Jen.
Marie, I love to hear you speaking of this, the conference that we because of COVID, about the unbearable oneness in publishing. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what that panel would have looked like, and we should still do that sometime in the future. And also, I had a question when you talked about prompts, and it was actually talking to you that I learned about this idea of prompts. Why are
right. Well, this is what's a really good question, because at one point when they asked me what my comps were, I said Anthony Doerr's The Light They Cannot See, because it's a war novel, and I just remember the editors, like your dreams, lady, because I was talking to Naomi earlier about how they wouldn't get me blurbs because Anthony Doerr is he's a Simon & Schuster author, so I said, can't you ask him for a blurb? And they're just really like, in your dreams, lady. Like they didn't even do it. So later, one of the things that has sort of saved the book, between the editor being a little less interested than I'd like, is, well, Simon & Schuster has a new fiction director, this guy named Tim O'Connell, who edited Charles Yu's National Book Award winner, and then a bunch of really funny books. He edited The Knicks, which actually shares some DNA with this book. And he came in, and then he was like, he's the person who read the book, and then he calls me and he goes, this book is fucking funny. And then through some weird miracle, is my editor, the one I was having trouble with, went to, get this, she went to go edit self-help books. And then Tim was allowed to take over. And so when we were talking about him taking over, I said, "Hello, Tim, who's my comp?" And he goes, among other things, he goes, besides Charles' book and the next, he goes, "Oh, I think Anthony Doerr's book is a lot like yours." And I was just like, oh, thank God. I finally have this editor who's, so that's not always the case. But I mean, his taste was like right on.
You didn't drop that Middlemarch bomb on there.
I know, right?
Comps are really, on one level toxic, because I don't know I don't know to what degree you can actually crystallize stereotypes more accurately than by identifying like 3 books or 4 books that are supposed to frame who you are.
No, they were calling this Crazy Rich Asians plus
Oh my
Pachinko.
God. There's
This-
no
that-
crazy reason.
I know, that's what they were telling booksellers, because my bookseller friend said this is what the bookseller told us, like the salesperson. And I was like, oh no. You know what I mean? It just made me feel like, oh, yuck. And then it would have been like they would wait 1 year, then plus Squid Games or something. You know what I mean?
Of course they didn't say Chang Wei-Li. I mean, you know, there's a little bit in there, but the tone is so different. It's so,
Yeah.
frankly, I mean, I love
He's
his
so
writing, but
serious.
this is so fun.
I'm glad.
You don't have to
so
work to
serious.
read this book, and you get a lot out of it. But I mean, you know, just timing-wise, I want to say it's probably time for us to go on to this next section. If you have additional questions, obviously, Maria will be here. I'll also be here. Thank you guys so much. Thank you again
And
so
get
much
this
for
Rise
hosting us.
book because it's amazing. I recommended it for my Oprah list.
She did, and this is a sort of cross support thing. I would have done this anyway.
He owes me now for Christmas.
Anyway, thank you guys so much. If you want to.
Oh, yeah.
I know it's the thing. Like we could just keep going on and on, like stay for hours. If you guys would like, I always love to get a photo with our authors because it's still to me super delightful to see people in person and to be able to convene like this. You know, I lived in New York briefly with my husband for 2.5 years, and my great delight was always to be able to go to in-person author events and hear the authors talk and feel the energy in the room. And I just really thank you for this opportunity and for being here. So we'll just take a quick group photo